What happens when the person you love the most becomes the one who hurts you the deepest? When the child you raised, protected, and sacrificed everything for suddenly treats you as disposable? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the moment a gentle heart breaks and decides it will break no more. It's about a quiet woman who spent years swallowing pain, smiling through humiliation, and convincing herself this is just how life is. Until one day something inside her snapped, not in rage but in clarity. And that clarity led to a revenge so unexpected, so poetic, and so emotionally satisfying that it didn't just change her life, it turned the tables completely. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with anger. It arrives with silence, dignity, and a plan. There are days in life that slide past quietly, blending into others so smoothly you barely remember them. And then there are days that split your world into before and after. For her, it began like any ordinary morning. The soft light creeping through the curtains, the stillness of a house that had forgotten warmth, and that familiar ache in her chest that she had learned to carry like a second heartbeat. She moved slowly, careful, tired but used to it. Used to being the quiet presence in her own home. Used to making herself small. Used to being needed, but never valued. She thought she understood life. She thought pain was something you simply live alongside. Until that afternoon, the moment that didn't feel dramatic at first, didn't come with thunder or shouting or doors slamming. It arrived dressed as normality, which somehow made it hurt even more. She still remembered the casual tone, the indifferent shrug, the way the betrayal wore the face of someone she loved more than life itself. That familiar voice that once cried in her arms as a child now sounded cold, irritated, impatient, as if love had an expiration date, and she had somehow outlived her usefulness. The words were simple, but they carried weight sharp enough to cut. "You'll be fine. You always figure things out." It wasn't just what was taken from her. It was the way it was taken, without hesitation, without guilt, without even a single backward glance. The person she raised, shielded, sacrificed for didn't even bother to check if the woman left behind would eat, sleep, or survive. And that's when the silence in the house changed. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like abandonment echoing through empty rooms. She stood alone after the door closed, surrounded not by walls but memories. Years of giving, years of forgiving, years of swallowing disappointment and calling it love. The house felt colder than ever. Her hands trembled, not from weakness but from something she didn't yet recognize. The quietness pressed hard against her chest, and for a long moment she simply stood there, unable to move. Hurt wasn't new to her. Disappointment wasn't new either. But this was different. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice, a conscious decision to leave her with nothing and expect her to wait, obedient and grateful, until needed again. And in that moment she realized something terrifying. She hadn't just lost trust. She had lost her place in her own life. But heartbreak has a strange way of transforming itself. Grief trembles, then steadies. Pain burns, then clears. And as hours passed and the silence stretched thinner, something inside her began to shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It felt like a whisper growing stronger, like a slow, steady light returning to a room that had been dim for too long. She wiped her face, not in surrender, but in defiance. The tears stopped not because she was done crying, but because she was done breaking, for the first time in a very long time. She didn't feel fragile. She felt awake. And in that quiet, aching house, on the day her world shattered, something new was born. Not rage, not hatred, but clarity. And clarity, as she would soon discover, can be the most powerful revenge of all. Before the betrayal, there was love. The quiet, patient kind that doesn't ask for applause, doesn't need recognition, and never writes its name in bold letters. Her life had always revolved around giving. She was the kind of woman who stayed awake so others could sleep peacefully, who went without so that someone else could have more, who smiled even when her heart felt heavy. Every wrinkle on her hands carried a story of sacrifices no one remembered, and every gray hair whispered of nights spent worrying about someone who eventually forgot to worry about her. She held the world together with soft hands and stubborn hope, believing that love, real love, meant never keeping score. Raising her child wasn't a burden. It was her greatest pride. She remembered tiny shoes on the floor, school mornings filled with rushing laughter, tears she wiped away, fears she kissed into silence. She remembered birthdays she worked extra hours to afford, holidays where she pretended everything was perfect even when life wasn't kind. She remembered standing in the shadows while pushing her child into the light, telling herself, "This is what mothers do." She never once imagined that those same hands she used to help would one day be the same hands that pushed her aside. Through the years, people would tell her, "You spoil too much. One day, you'll regret it." But she would laugh it off, defend the child she loved, and insist they were wrong. Because a mother always believes, always forgives, always hopes that one day her sacrifices will be repaid. Not with money, not with gifts, but with respect, kindness, and love. She never asked for grand gestures. She only wanted presence, gratitude, a gentle acknowledgement that she mattered too. But instead of appreciation, she received entitlement. Instead of tenderness, she received indifference. And slowly, without even realizing, she was losing herself while trying to hold on to someone who never truly looked back at her. Yet even now, remembering all those years, there was no hatred in her heart, just a deep, aching sadness, and a realization. She had spent her entire life teaching someone that, no matter what they did, she would always forgive, always stay, always sacrifice, and that was the mistake. Because when love turns into submission, sacrifice turns into expectation, and kindness turns into weakness in someone else's eyes. Something must change. Her story stopped being a tale of devotion. It was becoming a lesson. One life would deliver with painful precision. And soon, that sacrifice would become the very foundation of her revenge. Silence has a strange personality. Sometimes it comforts you, wraps around you like a warm blanket, offering peace. But on that day, silence felt like a living thing, sharp, cold, and merciless. The house, once filled with casual footsteps, laughter, arguments, and life, now echoed with emptiness. Every room reminded her of what she no longer had. Not just food or comfort, but dignity, value, and the sense of belonging. She opened cupboards and drawers not just looking for something to eat, but desperately searching for reassurance that she hadn't been completely forgotten. Instead, every hollow space whispered the same cruel truth. She had been left with nothing. Hunger crept in slowly. Not just the physical hunger gnawing at her stomach, but a deeper, emotional hunger. A hunger to be cared for. A hunger to be considered. A hunger to finally matter. She had spent years making sure someone else never felt this emptiness. Yet here she was, reduced to counting crumbs and pretending the loneliness didn't hurt. She tried to distract herself, to convince her heart it was just temporary. But every ticking second on the clock felt like it was mocking her. For the first time, she truly felt abandoned, not as a passing emotion, but as a reality settling into her bones. Nights became the hardest. The world outside slept peacefully while she lay awake staring into the darkness, listening to her own breathing just to prove she still existed. Memories played in her mind like painful films. Childhood laughter, promises once made, moments when love felt real. She wondered how someone she raised with warmth could grow into a person so cold. Had she failed? Did she love too much? Or had she simply taught someone that her kindness was endless and therefore unimportant? The questions burned more fiercely than hunger ever could. But silence, for all its cruelty, also reveals truths. And in the quiet, something inside her finally stopped begging, stopped hoping, stopped waiting. She realized that if she continued like this, she would not simply be forgotten. She would erase herself. And that she could no longer allow. Somewhere between tears and exhaustion, between weakness and pain, she made a promise to herself. She would not remain a victim in her own life. If no one else would stand for her, she would. And that promise, born in the darkest silence, would soon become the spark that changed everything. Pain has a way of stripping life down to its bare truth. It takes away illusions, excuses, the little lies we tell ourselves to make unbearable things feel tolerable. In the days that followed, she stopped defending what happened. She stopped saying, maybe it wasn't intentional, or they didn't mean it. No, they meant it. They chose themselves, and they chose convenience over humanity. And once she accepted that, the hurt didn't disappear, but it transformed. It stopped dragging her down, and instead began pushing her forward, like a cold, steady wind behind her back, reminding her that she deserved more than survival. She deserved respect, dignity, and her own life back. She began noticing things differently. The same house that once felt like a shrine to the past suddenly looked like a prison built from her sacrifices. Every antique, every precious possession, every reminder of what she had saved instead of living, now felt heavy, suffocating. For years she had believed these things were symbols of love, tradition, and future security. Now she saw them for what they truly were. Chains, objects she preserved for someone who didn't preserve her. Treasures meant for a future she was never going to be part of. And the irony hit hard. She had starved emotionally and physically while living in a house full of wealth she never allowed herself to touch. Clarity didn't roar. It didn't arrive in anger or chaos. It came quietly, almost kindly, like a calm voice whispering, "Enough. Enough waiting. Enough forgiving people who never apologized. Enough saving everything for someday while losing today." She realized she had spent decades living as a supporting character in her own life story. That had to change. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Now. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what others would feel or say. She was thinking about herself, her hunger, her needs, her right to exist as more than a sacrifice. And with that clarity came strength. Not the loud kind people show off, but the steady, unshakable strength of someone who has finally found their limit. She wiped her tears, straightened her back, and breathed differently. Deeper, steadier, with purpose. There would be no dramatic confrontation just yet, no screaming declarations of revenge. Instead, there would be decisions. Thoughtful, careful, life-changing. Decisions that would not only restore her dignity, but remind the one who betrayed her that kindness is a gift, not a weakness. And when you abuse it, life has a way of balancing the scales. Revenge doesn't always begin with rage. Sometimes it starts with something much quieter. A calm decision made in the stillness of a tired heart. One morning she stood in the middle of her living room and truly looked at her life. Not with guilt, not with nostalgia, with truth. The furniture, the heirlooms, the antiques, all those precious things she had guarded like sacred relics, suddenly felt meaningless. They had never hugged her, never fed her, never thanked her. She had preserved them for a future where she wasn't even supposed to exist. A future planned for someone who had already proven she wouldn't think twice before discarding her. And just like that, something shifted. She realized she didn't want to protect things anymore. She wanted to protect herself. The first step wasn't loud. It was a phone call. Simple, steady, brave. A number she never thought she'd dial. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the digits, but her voice was firm, calm. She wasn't begging for help. She wasn't asking for pity. She was making a business decision, one rooted in self-respect. When the voice on the other end answered, professional and curious, she didn't hesitate. For the first time in a very long time, she spoke not like a fragile mother, but like a woman taking control of her destiny. She wasn't selling memories. She was trading chains for freedom, and with every step that followed, she felt lighter. Strangers came and looked at what she once guarded like treasures. They saw value, real value, in what she had sacrificed her life to preserve. For the first time, she saw that value too, not because of what those things represented emotionally, but because of what they could now give her: choice, independence, life. Each item leaving her home wasn't a loss. It was a release of expectations, of emotional bondage, of years of silent suffering. The house, once filled with dusty history, began to feel open, breathing, alive. Was it revenge? Oh, yes. But not the cruel, explosive kind. This was poetic revenge, smart, beautiful, quiet. She wasn't getting even with anger. She was rewriting the rules entirely. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't hoping to be rescued. She was rescuing herself. And somewhere far away, completely unaware, the person who thought she would return to control everything had no idea that the world she expected to rule was already slipping through her fingers. The first move had been made, and it was flawless. As the days passed, the house transformed, and so did she. What once felt like a dusty museum slowly became a place that finally belonged to her. Empty spaces where heavy furniture once stood suddenly looked like freedom. Rooms that used to suffocate her now breathed. For years, everything inside these walls had been centered around someone else's comfort, someone else's future, someone else's entitlement. Now, for the first time, they reflected her. The quiet no longer felt cold or punishing. It felt peaceful, deliberate, earned. And every time she glanced at the refrigerator, overflowing with food she had chosen for herself, every time she touched something new, she bought simply because she wanted to. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Joy. Real, unapologetic joy. She started treating herself the way she had always treated everyone else. Warm meals replaced hunger. Soft music replaced tension. Laughter, gentle, private, healing, occasionally slipped out without permission. And with every small act of self-care, something inside her healed. She wasn't living in fear anymore, waiting for footsteps, waiting for approval, waiting to be told what was acceptable. She no longer felt like a guest in her own life. She was present now, fully aware, fully alive. There was something incredibly powerful about watching herself rebuild. Not from anger, but from dignity. All the while the world outside continued as usual. Vacations continued. Carefree days passed somewhere far away. The person who believed she had left behind a helpless, dependent woman likely imagined a quiet figure waiting, struggling, maybe even begging. Little did she know, the script had flipped entirely. The woman she underestimated had not only survived the storm, she had redesigned her entire world while the betrayer was still convinced she held control. And there was a beautiful stillness in that truth. No shouting, no confrontation yet. Just the calm, almost luxurious knowledge that when reality finally returned, it would collide with a truth impossible to escape. And deep inside, she didn't feel guilt. Not anymore. She had spent her entire life doing what was expected of her. Now she was finally doing what was right for her. The balance of power had shifted silently and irrevocably. She wasn't the weak one anymore. She wasn't the forgotten one. She wasn't the powerless mother waiting to be rescued. She was the storm now, quiet, composed, and ready. And soon, very soon, the one who left her behind would walk back into a world that was no longer theirs to control. The moment the door opened, the energy in the house changed. She didn't rush to greet. She didn't panic. She didn't even stand. She simply sat, calm, composed, sipping her tea like a queen in her own palace. The returning footsteps were loud, careless, confident. The footsteps of someone who believed life still revolved around them. There was laughter in the voice calling out through the hallway. A casual superiority as if nothing had happened. As if abandonment had been a minor inconvenience she should have politely endured. But that confidence began to waver the moment the first uneasy silence answered back, instead of the obedient warmth once expected. Annoyance came next, sharp, impatient, followed by accusation because control always panics when it doesn't find submission waiting. And then finally, hunger guided the betrayer into the kitchen, expecting emptiness, expecting poverty, expecting proof of suffering, just to justify their guiltless choices. What they found instead was extravagance, wealth, a refrigerator bursting with abundance so shocking it felt unreal. The cold light poured over rows of luxury, perfection, excess. Not wasteful, not random, but deliberate. Every beautifully stocked shelf screamed a truth louder than any argument ever could. She didn't starve. She didn't crumble. She didn't wait. There was no sound at first. Just breathing. Then came the scream. Not a scream of anger, a scream of disbelief. Betrayal reversed, reality collapsing. The world they thought they controlled slipping straight through their fingers. Eyes darted from shelf to shelf, trying to make sense of it, trying to rewrite the logic. This couldn't be. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. She was meant to beg. She was meant to suffer. She was supposed to be grateful when kindness returned. Instead, she had thrived without permission, and that fact hit harder than any shouted insult ever could. And through it all, she remained still, calm, powerful in silence. She didn't yell. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She simply existed, strong, peaceful, unshaken, and that terrified more deeply than rage ever would. Because in that silence lay the truth. She no longer needed approval, permission, or forgiveness. The balance of power had changed, and there was no going back. For the first time ever, it wasn't the betrayer deciding how the story ended. It was her. Shock didn't take long to evolve into desperation. The once confident voice began to tremble, drowning under confusion, fear, and anger, all tangled together. Words stumbled out. Accusations, excuses, frantic questions about where everything had gone, how this happened, why the house felt different, why the air itself felt stronger. Drawers opened, rooms were rushed through, footsteps echoed across empty spaces that once belonged to greed and entitlement. And that's when it truly hit. The things they always assumed would wait for them were gone. The life they planned to inherit without effort had vanished. Not stolen, not lost, chosen, sold, reclaimed. And the reality of that realization struck harder than any punishment ever could. Voices cracked, blame poured out as naturally as breathing. Somehow this was still unfair. Somehow she was crazy, ungrateful, reckless. Because how else does entitlement respond when its world shatters? Anger rose not from love, but from ownership, slipping away. Tears didn't fall because of guilt. They fell because of loss. Loss of control, loss of future comfort, loss of power. For the first time, the betrayer wasn't the one who left someone helpless. They were the helpless one now, and it terrified them. Every word they shouted echoed back against the empty walls like a reminder. Actions have consequences, but she didn't match their chaos. She didn't rise to their level or collapse beneath it. She simply spoke truths that had waited years to be heard. Calm, steady, unapologetic. She didn't need to justify survival. She didn't owe explanations for choosing herself. And the more peacefully she explained that she knew what had been planned behind her back, that she understood just how disposable she had become in their grand design, the quieter the room grew. Because truth is heavier than anger. It settles, it suffocates, and finally, it silenced the storm. Suddenly, the betrayer wasn't shouting anymore. They were standing there, exposed, cornered not by cruelty, but by reality. They had always assumed the mother would remain fragile, loyal to pain, obedient to guilt. But instead they stood facing a woman who had found her worth and wasn't stepping back into her chains. And that realization didn't just sting. It shattered something inside them. Because beneath the anger, beneath the denial, beneath every defensive word, lived the most painful truth of all. They didn't just lose things. They lost the person who once would have forgiven everything. Revenge doesn't always arrive with raised voices or shattered glass. Sometimes it arrives sitting calmly at a kitchen table sipping tea while the world of the guilty collapses around them. She didn't scream, didn't gloat, didn't throw their cruelty back into their face with rage. She didn't have to. Reality itself was the punishment. Every empty space in the house was a sentence written in bold truth. Every luxury lining the refrigerator was a reminder of choices made. She didn't take anything that wasn't hers. She didn't ruin anyone's life. She simply stopped sacrificing her own. And that was the cruelest, most poetic part. Her revenge was nothing more than self-respect. She looked them in the eyes and stated, with quiet dignity, that she had chosen to live, that everything sold, every decision made, every seemingly unthinkable step was not madness. It was survival. It was justice. It was balance. For years she had been told to endure, to be patient, to accept less than she deserved. But not anymore. She spoke with a strength they had never truly heard before. And every word burned, not because it was cruel, but because it was finally honest. They tried to bargain then, tried to rewind time. Apologies surfaced, but not from sincerity, from desperation. Suddenly they remembered family. Suddenly they remembered love. But it was too late, and somewhere deep inside, they both knew it. She wasn't punishing them out of bitterness. She was protecting herself from the cycle they would drag her back into if she allowed even a crack of weakness. Her forgiveness had always been their safety net. Removing it wasn't vengeance. It was liberation. And that was the final blow. Not the fridge full of forbidden luxury. Not the empty house. Not the money they would never touch. The true punishment was losing control over someone they believed would never leave. Revenge didn't roar that day. It breathed. It existed in her calm voice, in her unwavering gaze, in the unbreakable line she finally drew. For once, she wasn't afraid of being alone. And for the first time, they were terrified of losing her. That was the moment everything ended, and everything began. When the door finally closed, the house didn't feel empty. For the first time in years, it felt safe, peaceful, hers. No echoes of demanding footsteps, no shadows of expectations, no weight of unshed tears pressing against the walls. Just quiet. But this time, it was the good kind. The kind that hums with possibility. The kind that wraps you gently instead of suffocating you. She stood in the middle of her home and breathed, a deep, steady, liberating breath. And it felt like oxygen after years of drowning in silence. She wasn't allowed to interrupt. Life didn't magically become perfect after that day. Healing never happens in a single moment. But she wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't waiting for permission to feel joy. She wasn't trapped in fear of losing someone who had already proven they were willing to lose her. Instead, she began rebuilding herself, not around another person, not around obligations or guilt, but around who she truly was. A woman who had endured, who had loved too deeply, who had paid the price for misplaced loyalty, and who finally chose herself. She started laughing more, eating without shame, sleeping without fear, living without apology. And yes, there were memories. There were moments when love still tugged at her heart, because real love never disappears completely, even when it's broken. But now, those memories no longer owned her. They didn't dictate her future. They didn't drag her backward. They simply existed. Part of her story, not the whole of it. What defined her now wasn't pain. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't sacrifice. It was strength, clarity, freedom. She no longer felt like a forgotten chapter in someone else's life. She had become the author of her own. So, when people ask whether what she did was revenge or justice, she smiles softly. Because the truth is simple. She didn't destroy anyone. She didn't seek to break another heart the way hers had been broken. She simply refused to be disposable. She chose dignity over dependence, self-respect over fear, life over survival. And in doing so, she discovered the most powerful form of revenge in the world: peace. Not the peace others allow you, but the peace you claim for yourself and never let go. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the first honest beginning of her life.